Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on teens, screen time, and social distancing during the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Lori Crouch, EWA's Assistant Director. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, type them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And please ask your question at any time, and we will get to them during the Q&A toward the end. And with that, let me introduce today's moderator, Anya Kamenetz, education correspondent at NPR and author of The Art of Screen Time, How Your Family Can Balance Digital Media and Real Life. Thanks, Anya. Take it away.
Hi, Lori. Thanks, and welcome to everyone who is spending their Thursday with us. Really excited to be joined by this exceptional panel. It turns out when time and space is no object, you can get really amazing experts to come and lend their expertise. Today we've got Candace Odgers, who's one of my favorite researchers at the University of California, Irvine. She studies adolescent mental health. She spends a lot of time thinking about inequality, and she tracks youth on their mobile phones, hopefully without violating their privacy. Lydia Denworth is a contributing editor at Scientific American and is the author of the really hotly anticipated book, Friendship, The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. I feel like I was at my remote Seder, actually two last night, two Passover Seders with about 45 people. And something that people mentioned a lot was how much they're enjoying consciously reaching out to and connecting to their friends, even the ones that are far away. And I think that's a really interesting theme and one that we're going to explore today around teens. So yeah, so this moment with, 1.5 billion children out of school around the world is completely extraordinary and unprecedented. And it means that a lot of what we thought we knew, or what the conventional wisdom about what was best for teenagers, is really kind of not happening anymore. We're not really able to encourage them to connect with each other face to face because they're just not able to do that. So how do we think about their friendship and their connections and helping them maintain those in a healthy way while also helping them balance? So let's first talk about the basics here. So for Candace and Lydia, what does the research tell us about why peer relationships are so important developmentally at this stage? And also, what does research tell us about screen time and how it connects to adolescent relationships?
Well, so maybe I'll talk about friendship first, and I'll let Candace talk about screen time. So the critical thing to understand is that in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, the neuroscience of adolescence, or what we understand about the adolescent brain, has changed dramatically. We've learned a lot. And it starts with the fact that adolescence actually stretches from about the age of 10 to the age of 25. So your older kids, your college-age kids, might be surprised to hear that is how we think of them. But what that reflects is that the brain is still maturing and changing during that entire span of time, which is one reason why people speak a lot of using the word adolescent instead of teenager, because it isn't just 13 to 19. And in that time, the brain is designed to socialize. It's like one of the things that the adolescent brain is most it's most focused on. And that is because in part, one of the things we now understand is that there is this sort of second burst of growth in brain connections in the early part of adolescence, the very early part, and then that's being pruned back. But the brain is not developing, all parts of the brain are not developing at the same pace. And the emotional parts of the adolescent brain are, you could say, in overdrive. That won't surprise anyone who knows any teenagers, but they're coming by it naturally. So their limbic systems and the parts of their brains that are handling reward and threat and all kinds of things are really overactive. And then the parts of their brains that are controlling judgment and executive function and rational thinking are still progressing, but they're moving along at a more plodding sort of linear way. And there's this gap, right? And so emotion overtakes thinking and reason, and that explains a lot about how adolescents behave. But it really helps to explain why their friends are so central to their lives and their social relations matter so much. It's kind of it's the perfect neurobiological storm, adolescence, when your sense of who you are and your identity is growing, and your awareness, your sensitivity to social acceptance and rejection is growing, and your sort of concerns with the presence of your friends is actually far more rewarding to your brain than it is when we are adults. Just even though I enjoy being with my friends, we all enjoy being with our friends a lot, and we are rewarded in our brain, teenagers are actually rewarded more. And so that's the signal they're getting. And so it just sort of helps to really understand, I think, for parents and for other adults and for teachers and anybody writing about adolescence, that is how they are wired, and that is what they are set up to do. And I'll let Candace talk about social media.
Yeah, so I love the reference to friends being so important during this stage. And there's this quote from a focus group at Common Sense Media, which is, parents think I'm addicted to my phone. I'm not. I'm addicted to my friends, right? And phones are one of the ways that adolescents have been connecting increasingly, over the last decade. And it's been interesting to watch over the past couple of weeks as we've seen really the concerns and the narrative around screen times flip, right? The script has been flipped really quickly to concerns about whether kids are spending too much time, how much time kids are spending, to how can we make the time they're spending on their screens good, right? Safe. How can we use social media to connect kids now that they're disconnected from their everyday lives, which is painful to see, right? They need those friendships. Their brains need them. Their bodies need them. Their social development needs them. And I think the thing that's one of the messages I've been saying a lot is that even before this, the kids needed screens to connect with their kids, right? Or to their friends. They were getting a lot of positive kind of reinforcement from those interactions. And what we found, and what a number of other people have found, if you review a lot of the research in this area, what you find is that there's very little evidence that all of that time they were spending connecting to their friends, chatting with their friends on screens was harming those relationships. In fact, what you often found was that kids that had really strong friendships and relationships offline often had those strong networks online. And so what we're asking now is not kind of whether or not kids should be spending less time. A lot of parents' attitudes are changing pretty quickly right now on this topic. But how can we support kids online? How can we create spaces that are safe, or help them to create spaces that are safe to maintain those friendships for whatever duration of time they're physically separated?
So Candace, from the point of view of reporters who are trying to cover this and the script's been flipped so quickly, what do you think, what kinds of information and angles do you think that we should be getting out to parents who may not have, may not be familiar thinking about how to guide our teenagers into positive interactions online and away from negative ones, right? Because we're kind of having collective experience of knowing, gosh, I've had too much time taking in the news, or I'm going into a spiral that's not productive, versus I use social media to connect with my friends and I'm feeling really good. So what do parents need to know to navigate this? How can reporters get that information out there?
Yeah, so I think Lydia raised a great point about adolescents being 10 to 24. So parents of kids at those different ages need to know really different things, right? And so for the parents of 10 to 13-year-olds who are now going to be seeing even more of a spike of that time online interacting, a lot of that is about parents being more present and kind of helping to scaffold that use, right? So not just dropping them off into the abyss of social media. So maybe spending some time finding some shared social media experiences online. Conversation is still the best kind of route into this, right? So talking to your kids. We don't see them all day at school, and we ask them at the end of the day how the day was, who they talked to. So ask them what they were doing online. Try and enter those worlds when you can, or when they'll let you and you're not being too intrusive. But those conversations at those ages. For older adolescents, they have their patterns of screen time and social media established. They're going to shift a little bit during this time. And one of the things that we see a lot is that most kids are kind of thriving, spending their time safely online, connecting with friends. Those kids who are having some bad experiences around harassment, bullying, more anxiety, you can often see that offline. So it's not that they become two different kids. So one of the positive things is that you can still see those difficulties and those warning signs. Now there's the older kids who might have entered back, I should say adolescents, who are now back in the home again, those 20 to 24-year-olds, and that's going to be a completely different conversation around kind of how screens work. But I will say that one of the kind of key risks in this period right now, when this is hitting, is youth that are going through a transition, right? So those youth that will be getting ready to transition to middle school, right? To high school, to college, right? And so how can parents think about ways to connect them? Maybe it's a virtual college walkthrough. Maybe it's taking a little bit extra time to connect to those kind of new environments as they're going forward. So we're gonna have to think creatively about how this is hitting kids across adolescence that should be transitioning to kind of a new offline setting next year.
Can I just add two quick things? One is to piggyback on what Candace said. I think that in addition to looking at the social media side of it, looking at the difference as a reporter for young adolescents and older adolescents is probably going to be quite interesting, and that there are a lot of ways that might play out. And the second thing is that the point about transitions is one I was going to bring up as well, because I'm doing a lot of reporting now, and I generally do about mental health, and now I'm looking at resilience and coping in this. And transitions are always, as you're pointing out, a moment of stress for teenagers, even if it's a positive transition, right? I mean, for all of us that's true, but it's especially true for adolescents. And so maybe trying to think creatively about as a reporter, about how those transitions will change, and where there might be new kinds of transitions, or just looking for that kind of rub is, I think, an important thing to do.
Yeah, I can say
one
that.
of the stories that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, one of the story, I haven't seen a lot of coverage of this, but it's a crucial issue with adolescent brain development and social media, is around sleep, right? So we've been fighting for a very long time to get these school start times moved. And so for parents, what we're saying is let your adolescents sleep now, let them catch up on that sleep deficit. They're going to be able to perform better in online schools. They're going to it's going to help their mental health. It's going to help them during times of sleep. But as a reporter, I would think there'd be a lot of interesting kind of reporting in terms of how that sleep might be shifting, and how we could carry some of that positive change into the next phase.
That's a really interesting point. And I think, I think a big part of the coverage of adolescents up to now, it's really been missing a recognition of the importance of their friendships. And so sometimes there might be a tension between, allowing teens that free space to connect with their friends and seeing how important that is, versus wanting to control their time, especially if you're living on top of each other. And, I, as a parent, have a lot of ideas about how you should be spending your time. You should be sleeping, doing chores, you should be doing your schoolwork, anything except for chatting with your friends. So how can we, Lydia, what's the scientific evidence and the research-backed way to convey to an audience the importance of that time with their friends and how it should take its place alongside other priorities?
So I have a whole chapter on this in my book, and I think that what was striking to me was, and I will say that chapter was partially excerpted in The Atlantic, and it went viral. And I only bring that up as a point of saying how unfamiliar this stuff must be for people to really realize how critical friendship is at this age. And I didn't expect that to be so unexpected, but I guess it was. And so what I think is really interesting is to look for the places in kids' lives where they get that unstructured time, and there's not a lot of it anymore, right? And I think it is one of the reasons why, so for instance, as you're just saying, like we as parents, we often, and as educators too, complained when kids were talking to each other in class. And I get that it's disruptive when people are interacting with their friends, but it also turns out that the research says that kids in class, and I recognize that they're not in class in a regular way, but the point is important, is that kids in class who were working with a good friend often had deeper, more constructive conversations and did more creative projects. And I don't think that's what teachers would have expected, because most of what I ever hear from teachers in my own kids' conferences is tell him to stop talking to his friend, right? And so kids have to meet the teachers halfway on that. And I don't know what that looks like in remote learning necessarily, but it might well be that making sure kids are paired up with someone that they're close to at least part of the time in the work that they're doing now is a way both to get them thinking creatively, but also just to make sure that they're getting time with the people that they're close to. And the other thing that I would say is that on the social media front, to again echo some of what Candace has said about we're flipping the script, but the other thing that I'm just noticing, and I'm not hearing very many people remark on, is how the fact that kids, or the criticism before was always, you know, these kids don't know how to interact in person and they don't care about it and all they want to do is be on their phones. And people said, you know, friendship seems to have disappeared. They've lost that skill. But then you saw, as soon as they were told that they could not be with their friends in person, they all flipped out mostly, right? And they worked really, really hard and came up with creative ways. You know, they sat across the sidewalks from each other and yelled across the street, or they took tape measures to the parking lot and sat in their different cars, you know, 6 feet apart, and so that they could see each other in person. So I think that gives the lie a little bit to the at least at a population level, the idea that these kids don't care about being together in person. And I think that being together in person speaks to this importance of friendship.
You know, I think that's a really good point, Lydia, and it also gets to what I consider to be perhaps something that the media could take on a little bit differently, which is, I don't know if you were following, but the Governor Cuomo made many public comments about like youth playing basketball, and that was his like paradigm of how people are not respecting social distancing, mm-hmm. and there's, you know, an undercurrent of discrimination in that characterization, that it's young people that are being irresponsible and for these reasons. But it's also very real that, you know, we worry about young people pushing the limits on social distancing or not understanding the reasons for it. And could we balance our coverage of that with an understanding of just how driven they are to connect with each other and how we might support that?
Yes, you're exactly right. And also the point that that their judgment and their ability to plan ahead and to think through the consequences of their actions is just not as good. It doesn't mean that we give them a free pass, but at least we should start by understanding that, and that need to be with their friends. Now, I will say the thing I'm hearing from parents of teenagers or adolescents who started out being really sort of difficult and obstinate about, you know, insisting that they couldn't be kept in the house and they needed to see their friends, that has changed, I think, some as the weeks have gone by. And I think everybody is understanding more, including the younger people, is understanding the gravity of this. But I'm not sure. I don't know, Candace, if you are seeing the same thing.
Yes, I think there's this idea that young people are escaping this crisis in terms of not being as vulnerable to the virus itself. But if we look kind of historically, we see that these kinds of shocks, you know, natural disasters, economic downturns, the youth are affected, and they're affected, and they will be affected in the months and the years to come. And so figuring out ways and reporting on ways to support young people, especially young people that are caught in especially vulnerable situations, with parents with job loss, mm-hmm. in situations where people have lost their life or their health to the virus, in situations where they're, you know, and the reporting on the 4 and 10 kids who are not logging on yet to online schools, mm-hmm. kind of how that gap grows. So I think there is a story to be told that's not looking at youth as just being sullen and sulking away in their rooms about not being able to see each other, but one in which there are aspects of this that will hit this generation and that will stay with this generation for years to come. And there are opportunities for us to act now to support them versus kind of demonize them in terms of not caring or just wanting to play basketball or whatever that kind of narrative is.
I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up, Candace, because like you said, I reported on this Common Sense Media survey, and it also squares with what I've seen elsewhere, that there's potentially a lower level of engagement in remote learning among teens. And the research would all suggest from past disasters that teens are the ones that are most at risk because they're in a transition point of being disconnected from education and not going back to it. But I wonder if there's something in the research, Lydia, that we could harness to look at how learning experiences could become more engaging for teens. Can we get them grouped with their friends and help them find a safe space online? I have seen that remote learning, teachers are treating crosstalk among the students as being a distraction from what they're trying to get done, as opposed to this is a gathering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, look, I do think that teachers are trying. Most of them are really trying. I think it's important to say that, like, they've been handed a really, really difficult task, and everybody's kind of figuring out as they go along. So I know that I have one still in high school, and they've already done a sort of wholesale change for how it's structured. So I think that that's one thing, is that noticing whether schools are being flexible in how they do this and are sort of making changes as they go, and talking to them about what they're learning, about what's working and what's not, is just an interesting question to me. In terms of the evidence for learning, I'm less familiar with some of that work, but I do think that, as I said, the importance of being with their friends, but also maybe the chance for interactive work here, or where, we know for sure from the evidence that having to teach something to someone else helps you learn it better, things like that. And so that there are probably more ways. I mean, my sense is that a lot of the classes that are going on do have kind of a lecture, when there's just a lecture going on, and that's probably more for college than for younger ages. I don't know, but that does not seem to be working with the kids that I'm talking to and who I'm reporting on. But Anya, I'm thinking you maybe have done more looking at this specifically than I have.
Sure. I mean, I think collaboration and online learning is usually a win, just as it is in the classroom. And, offering people the chance to connect and participate makes it more effective than just a typical kind of lecture. And I mean, again, like you said, this is kind of a disaster response education, and it wasn't designed this way from the ground up. And with more time, I'm sure there could be more creative types of learning that goes on. But we're also seeing, I think, that teenagers are being creative themselves and figuring out ways to collaborate. NPR ran a story about high school choirs that are maintaining their practicing and even performance schedules using Zoom and different kinds of technology. And we're also seeing, I mean, this was a phenomenon before this happened, right? The idea of using things like TikTok and having something that was viral that went from one person to another person to another person. Have you seen any good examples of that, Candace?
I was thinking in terms of the way that the kids are connecting, and one of the challenges we have in mental health is that adults kind of rush in and in time of crisis try and design something and kind of push it out to them, right? And that's a strategy that it doesn't tend to work. And we see this in kind of the mental health app space, where it's just flooded with kind of mindfulness or all of these things. And the strategy that a number of people that I work with have been taking recently is just finding youth where they are. And finding how that's emerging kind of organically. And I think that there's a couple of interesting stories probably to be told around in the gaming world, right? So we see this kind of massive uptick. You have these Twitch streamers, you have people who have massive followings, who have interests in mental health, who have interests in kind of helping young people come together and kind of engage in positive change. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in those spaces and how they can be facilitated without being co-opted by, kind of caring adults and have that feel less genuine for young people. But, the things that are forming organically, and I think that is the beauty of some of the digital tools that allow youth to kind of create spaces and create connections. It would be nice to see, I think, and what you're both referencing is some of the teams that do have those offline supports, kind of reaching out to young people in their schools or communities, their groups, their teams that might be more vulnerable at this time, and engaging that kind of near peer support and kind of however we can help to provide tools for that.
Right. And I'd just like to say that one of the ways that people cope and show resilience generally in adults too is by having a purpose and meaning and something to do that gets them moving forward and gets them, and it can be something really serious like volunteering and helping to get your community going, but it can also be something just personal, some personal goal or something that's even a little bit silly, but say, well, okay, let's you and me cook our way through this cookbook or watch all the same 10 movies and talk about them. And so encouraging kids to do that with each other and to look for some sort of project and that gives them a sort of, ongoing purpose, I think is going to be, whether schools can do that and the remote learning can do that or parents can do that, there's all kinds of ways that can be true. And another thing I just wanted to bring up from the point of view of possible stories is, Anya, when you mentioned the virtual choirs, that reminded me that I really think the loss of extracurricular stuff is hitting kids truly hard. And I say that as someone with a high school junior who's trying to be recruited to play basketball in college, and the entire recruiting season is pretty much gone from what we can tell. And, being on that team and this is everything for him. And the same is true of kids who are in theater or in music. And it also sort of highlights for me how important those extracurriculars are in terms of kids. And when I think about friendship and adolescent development, it's all about your sense of who you are and your identity, and those things that you do outside of the classroom are so critical. So I'd really love to see people explore just, first of all, what this reveals about how important that is in an adolescent's life, and then what people are doing to compensate.
I think that's such a great point, Lydia. I mean, it goes back to that comment about teens playing basketball, right? It's like we don't take seriously the need that they're fulfilling by doing that. And you're right. I mean, the question of compensating, but also just the question of how seriously they take that and how important that is to staying connected to the school community. I have been recently talking to young climate activists from around the world, and they've had to pivot and do a lot more of their work online, where before they were using social media mainly to tell other people about their protests. But it's been really inspiring for them because there's kind of showing how people that felt isolated before now feel more connected than ever, and they're finding like ways to connect internationally and see that other people are in the same boat as them. And I think that there's some interesting things that could come out of this as far as organizing, and that's one way that teenagers do express themselves and find meaning.
Yeah. And I'll just say that, I mean, on the friendship front, the thing that I'm finding is amazing. I mean, my book came out at the end of January, just as but this was sort of still distant then. And, it got a lot of attention, but it was something people take for granted. And then now that it's gone, right? It's that, I mean, there's how many thousands of country music songs that have that, absence makes the heart grow fond. You don't know what you have till it's gone. But what I hope is that it's true for friendship and social connection in this moment, and that I think it's true in other ways too, that kids and teenagers are seeing how much they liked going to school, or seeing, like, I think it's interesting to ask them what they miss most, basically. And all of us are seeing how much we miss social connection in person, but there's other things too that I think are probably fall into that bucket that would be interesting to explore.
I think it's also interesting to ask parents that question, right? What have they learned about who their young person is becoming, right? So we're spending a lot more time together, and just learning everything from different things and their learning styles when you become the kind of point person for online learning, but also spending a lot more time in conversation and shared activities, and how that changes relationships.
And there are some families for whom this is really rare, and some of them are the privileged families where the parents were traveling all the time, or like they're having dinner together every night, and that's not how they normally operated. And so that's kind of an interesting, it's a sort of sidebar, and it might be true it might be true across the socioeconomic spectrum. I'm not sure. It depends on what it is you're dealing with and grappling with, but looking at how it looks different to be together, as you're talking about, Candace, I think is super interesting.
What families are learning about each other.
Yeah,
but also too, this question of how the pandemic is hitting adolescents at different parts of the socioeconomic spectrum and different identity groups, I think is really crucial. We can't just portray one one image of what this is like. And what do you do when you have a teenager who is borrowing their parents' smartphone to keep in touch? Are they going to be able to connect to friends or, even to school?
Absolutely.
We've also seen a lot of debate among adults how this varies regionally in terms of how much of a crisis this is perceived at. And we haven't seen a lot of kind of youth voice, right? So youth that are being raised in counties that share that belief more widely, kind of what kind of information they're getting about the epidemic, about how serious it is, and so how they're calibrating that. So just geographical, regional differences in terms of how that information gets filtered to young people and how they are appraising this risk. And we know going through these kinds of stressful life events or disasters, a lot of it, how kids do at the end of it will depend on their appraisal of how bad it was.
Well, and that gets to a different question, which Candace, you might have some research on, which is teenagers' critical consumption of the media and their engagement in misinformation and disinformation, helping teenagers make sense of the news and things that they might be reading online. And I mean, what do you think about this, Lydia, in terms of who teenagers are likely to trust?
So that's so interesting. I think it's an opportunity. I'm not sure who they are likely to trust, but it's an opportunity for the adults in their world to talk to them about exactly what you're saying here, the critical thinking. And so Candace is back, so we can see whether she's got research on this about trust and loyalty. And I think that they're pretty savvy consumers of the internet, actually. It was older adults. There was that really interesting study about the political skewing that said that it was really the older adults who tended to believe things that were not true online, the fake news that was distributed, and that was not the young people. So I'm thinking that means that they have some sense of what are trustworthy sources and what are not, but I'm not sure. Candace, have you worked on that?
So we haven't worked on this specifically. We've been leading up to track youth through the US election to kind of understand more of their online conversations about this. But what we do know in this crisis is that they're disconnected from places where they typically bounce their ideas or their thoughts off of other people. So they get a wider kind of perspective when they're in the classroom or when they're in school, people that might think a little bit differently than them. So it would be interesting to understand kind of how the social distancing and the filtering of information, if it's restricted more to families or common media sources, is siloing off those kind of perspectives. So, and it would be very interesting from a reporting perspective, think of that first year university when young or older adolescents leave their homes, their views are challenged, they're in that process of kind of forming these new identities and reconciling this information about the world. And now they're going back to the places that they came from and seeing them in a very different eye. So I think that would be a fascinating kind of set of people to follow.
Yeah, I can. So I have 3 boys. One was a college senior. One, I told you, was a high school junior trying to be recruited and do the college search. And the last one was for first year in college. So every single one of them has hit some sort of major moment where this is especially difficult. I mean, they're fortunate kids in many ways, and so they're not suffering in the way that other people are, but I do think it's interesting. This is not equally distributed in terms of the enormity of the disruption, whether you're socioeconomically or depending on where you were in your trajectory. And that's something people have been talking about already, of course, but I still think it's interesting. And one thing I'll say in that is that when I asked my kids, well, what about this is hardest for you? They did talk about the sort of loss of closure. So for instance, my college first year, they left in the middle of, they had already left for spring break. So they didn't even get to say goodbye because then they just were told to go back and grab their stuff out of their dorms if they could and not to come back. And so there was, they left thinking they were coming back. Others, left and said, of course, there's this famous stories of colleges where everybody had rave parties for weekends, which they should not have done. But, I understand why. It was the sort of end of times. They thought of, my college senior said, this was our graduation party. This was what we were, this was how we were saying goodbye. So closure is an interesting piece of this.
Lydia, is there material in your book about kind of friendships in transition times and how how friendships mark certain stages of your life?
There is. So there's chapter on the landscape. I mean, so the book does trace friendship across the lifespan, and there are multiple chapters that, so one is about babies, and then another about children and adolescent, and then looking at what friendship looks like in adulthood, and then at the end of life. And it's less about, so the childhood and adolescence is partly the looking at, as we talked about before, the sort of early adolescence and later in adolescence, but what's striking to me is how much similarity there is in just how socially, obsessed they are all the way through. In adulthood, of course, you have the natural, like the 20s or right out of college, you're all living with all your college friends and things like that. In your 30s is where friendship goes to die, is what they say when people have kids and things. But that's not what we're talking about today. But, there's a way. So I do cover a bit about how it changes over time, and also how within the school trajectory. So for instance, in middle school, critically, and I don't think everybody understands this, in America, where so many kids come to 6th grade from a smaller school and feed into a bigger school, fully 2/3 of kids change friends between September and June of 6th grade. 2/3, right? And so what that tells you is just how normal that is. And yet the kids going through it, I think, don't see it that way. And part of the reason that happens is because you often hang on to the people you knew from elementary school at the beginning. And then we talked already about how your interest in extracurriculars or your sense of who you are begins to change, especially in that time in middle school. And then you start to gravitate maybe to the basketball players or to the theater kids or the computer science, the ones who want to design video games. And that's normal. That's, you tend to be friends with the people you spend the most time with. So if you're, so I just think that change, that amount of change that happens with friendship, and the same thing happens high school to college, and then college and just out. And so there's some studies in the book that I recount that show just how dramatically it changes in terms of, like, they've done it with cell phones. It's interesting, now that's one of the things they can do is they can see, well, who are you calling? And so they can see how it changes, how you stop calling the same people from high school and you start calling the new people or things like that. So that's, there's a bit of that in there.
Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me when you're saying that now that this crazy thing has happened and everyone has moved online, there's a digital divide in access to friendship. And so children and teenagers who have unlimited devices at their house and unlimited bandwidth can be in touch with friends all the time. And then there might be another child who is just as good of a friend. And when they go to school together, it doesn't matter. But now they don't have that bandwidth. They don't have that data plan. It's like they're not there anymore. They don't know what's going on. Candace, have you ever studied like social divisions and how they connect with access to technology?
Yeah, so we did, we looked at the digital divide issue it was a representative sample of young people in North Carolina across socioeconomic class. And it turns out that children from low-income families often have access to mobile devices on the same level as those from higher income, but they don't have the broadband access, which you, of course, require for for that. But they're often sharing the devices and have kind of a lower grade device, so they wouldn't have that part of it. So the device issue was becoming a bit less of an issue, and it was more the parental support or adult support around creating those accounts for younger adolescents, because you often need to be at a certain age. Some require parental verification, some just require a parent that can sort through all the passwords and manage all of this for them. There's this kind of myth, I think, that youth are really tech savvy in the kind of IT sense, which is not necessarily the case. I think they're creative in how they connect and use platforms, but not necessarily in terms of troubleshooting all of the hassles you have to get your kids connected in a safe and creative place. And so a lot of the differences that you end up seeing are due to the absence of adults in the home who are able to or willing to kind of support that digital ecosystem, right?
Another thing I think is interesting to think about, it's not the digital divide, but the social divide, because, we always hear from a mental health perspective about the fear of missing out among kids. And I've already seen some stories about this, but now people are talking about the joy of missing out. So the introverts, like, there are a bunch of kids for whom this might actually be like the kid who wasn't going to get invited to the prom. kind of interesting to think, well, how is this for you? And for the first time, there are no parties that you are missing out on, right? And so it's a social divide, but it's the difference between the actively popular and the ones who are quieter, more introverted, or less. And I don't know a whole lot about that, how that's playing out, but I think it would be curious. I'd be curious to explore that divide as well.
Or just in how to encourage your young person to develop those internal resources, because kids that knew how to enjoy their own company. I mean, you see the same thing with adults. Some people are like, "Yay, I get to read my books and knit and read,"
Right,
and
exactly.
other people are just starved for human interaction. And obviously, that extrovert and introvert dimension occurs in adolescence as well.
Yes.
But I'm sure their parents just need them to accept them however they are, and
I think it's important. So Lydia had brought up this point early on about how adolescents are wired for social interaction and for friendship. And there's actually a physical withdrawal, I think, that's happening here that we have to be sensitive to as parents. And, the grouchiness and my youngest, she finished her Zoom classroom and she just wanted to be held, because seeing her friends and seeing her teacher online evoked a response to her that was usually associated with physically being next to them. If you watch kids on a playground, it's touching, shoving, bumping, there's these sensory things that are just not there anymore. And that kind of deprivation, I don't think we know, when across ages, what that means. We haven't touched even on romantic relationships and friendships during adolescence and how important that is in terms of learning. But just, thinking about what that, not just not being able to see your friends, but all of the sensory stuff that goes around contact.
Yeah, and speaking of romance, I think a really interesting story here would be sexting right now. Maybe people have already done it, I don't know, but and at the EWA workshop in February in Berkeley, there was a great, I think his name is Jeff Temple. Maybe Laurie can correct me if I have that wrong, but he's an expert in sexting, and he spoke, and I'm very curious to see how this is affecting, how I hope older adolescents are engaging online in that.
I mean, I agree. I think that's worth exploring, not necessarily in a condemnatory way, but also you have to pay attention to the fact with more children online, that means more exposure to predators as well, and security issues that can happen, especially with like long unsupervised time online.
And actually, Anya, just let me clarify to say that Jeff's point was that sexting is actually a normalized behavior now. He no longer thinks, right? He does not think of it. He started out his research thinking it was harmful, and of course it can be, and predators is a big issue. But now he sees it very differently, which I thought was really intriguing. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could be in the spectrum of normal and healthy adolescent sexual behavior. Then there's also revenge porn, non-consensual image sharing, and predatory behavior. So there's a whole spectrum of things that should not be lumped together, but are all kind of worth looking at, I think, in this new always online context. Because like a teenager who might not have done sexting before, maybe now this is an option that they have, and maybe they don't know how to do it safely.
True.
Laurie, do we have questions?
Yes. So I also want to encourage our audience to type your questions into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel and include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. But in the meantime, Natalie Pate from the Statesman Journal asks if there are ways for adolescents to, I think you've kind of answered this, but I liked some of the things she brought up. Adolescents to interact without screens while in quarantine, like writing letters or, making old-fashioned phone calls. Do those offer the same type of social interaction that they need and crave?
They offer some for sure, and I think they're very important. And I think it's actually a lovely moment to sort of go old school and have pen pals and things like that, And I do see. I mentioned it at the beginning, but I'll say again that kids are being creative about seeing each other in person, not on screens, and so they're if they live in a place where it's possible, maybe they're on their stoops in the city, apart from each other, or they're in their cars in a parking lot and they're not getting out of their cars, they're talking, and so there are all kinds of ways to do that. And there are ways, and I hope that we will also encourage them to engage to be social with their families, as we talked about before, in ways that they might not have been. But it's also true that we really do have to embrace digital technology in this moment. It's what we have, and imagine if we didn't have it, I think this would be a very different, as hard as this is, it would be very, very much worse.
I do want to say that, I don't know if our teens are looking for advice from us, but there are ways to connect online to make it a little more interactive. So, can you do an art project together? Can you cook together? Can you play some kind of game? A friend of mine was doing a thing where you spin a wheel, and then somebody has to do something silly, and even a game that you can play online together, right? All kinds of things, words with friends and that kind of thing. So helping your teen get excited about planning some kind of virtual gathering might be a nice thing to do if they're not the type to proactively connect with a bunch of people. I know that with my 8-year-old, I've taken the there's some of her friends find it very easy to connect, and other friends need a little more help. And so just making sure that, have you talked to so-and-so in a while? I know that she's stuck at home with a sick, family member. So maybe you'd like to reach out to them. And so helping facilitate that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I saw
I think it's also
tweet.
interesting to think about. I think it's always so interesting to think about when you do the content analysis of what kids talk about when they're, before COVID, it was often about offline things, right? So, or arranging to do things together, or things that had happened in school. So there's also a shift that's happening in terms of how youth are chatting online. They don't have those offline experiences or kind of meetups that happen. So it's going to change, and there's going to be these kind of gaps that maybe can be filled by these more kind of interactive things, or creating the opportunity for interactions without the physical contact. Sorry, go ahead, Lori.
I was going to mention that a friend on Twitter talked about her niece and her niece's friends getting together and doing PowerPoint presentations via Zoom on their favorite topics, like astronomy or something else. So educational and social.
Exactly.
Natalie also asks about how she's been told by educators pre-COVID that screen addiction starts at an early age, and that it's like causing problems with infant synaptics. And she wondered, is there a concern about screen addiction?
This is a question that I've been fielding. The World Health Organization does talk about internet gaming disorder patterned after other behavioral addictions. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual lists internet addiction as being a condition for further study currently, so it's not officially classified as an addiction. Regardless of either of those, I'm not sure that I think of addiction as being the most helpful paradigm for thinking about this. I share the framework of problematic media use, which focuses a lot more on the kind of the behaviors and the emotions around screen use, which tend to be kind of, our screens taking up a lot of space in a child's life that are not crowding out other things, crowding out friendships, crowding out any other kind of reward in their life. So this is the only thing that seems to kind of make their day good or bad, is whether or not they get screen time. So obviously the territory's changed really quickly in the last few weeks, where we are now using screens to connect with family, to connect with school, to connect with extracurriculars. And so I still think that it's worth paying attention for kids to kind of the explosive behaviors and emotions that can come from too much screen time when the screens are taken away, and to try to institute a healthy balance. But instead of, detoxing completely, that might be appropriate in some cases to really take it away completely. Are there ways that we can scaffold our kids to get on and off of the screen with a little more grace and to transition to the new activities? I think that's something you can try even with very young children to help them understand we're going to have this much, and when the timer goes off, you're going to do something else, and we're going to be sad, but then we can move on to the next thing. And if you can't move on to the next thing, then we'll have to say no. That's what I do with my 3-year-old. So, you know, it's hard to talk about screen addiction when screens are providing so much of what our kids need right now. You know, there still might be a place, depending on what your family routine is and what you're using the screens for, you might have the ability or might find it easier to take them away completely, at least for, you know, maybe for a day, a week, or for a certain period of time during the day. But I don't think that's the only answer out there. And I also don't think that addiction is the most useful paradigm for thinking about it. Do you guys have thoughts?
I would just add one thought, and I'd let Candace, I think she's probably got more to say than this, but I just related to the idea of addiction. And so my social filter is that I really think it's important to point out that video gaming anyway is an incredibly social activity for most kids. So 3/4 of them are doing it with someone. Either they used to be in the room together, not anymore, of course, but either online or on their phones while they're doing it. And I just am not sure that parents and adults in general are really realizing that. You know, we tend to see the video game and not the connection that's going on. So I wanted to just point that out.
Actually, in my house, the rule is you have to play a video game with a friend.
There you go.
At least on video chat. One of you might be playing, the other one's watching, but you're on chat with somebody.
Right, but you're interacting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Candace, did you want to add?
I'd agree with everything that's said here. I think it's one of those, also the situations with addiction is that if you interview young people, which when we survey them, they all say that they're addicted to their phones, and parents say it also. But we've done it side by side where we ask about these kind of addiction type things. Are you addicted? Is it interfering? They'll report that they believe it is, but we actually have objective measures. We take their school grades, we take physical health measures, mental health. We don't see the interference. So it's a really strong and powerful narrative. And I think in this moment, as screen use is shooting up, having varying different views on that for adolescents themselves, for parents about this kind of idea of an addiction, you know, can be causing a lot of conflict, right? So the number one thing that parents and youth fight about before COVID was the amount of time on screens, not what kids were doing on screens.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to have that kind of conflict inserted into kind of homes right now and have this kind of addiction narrative feed on itself. So I think it's important, a message that's important to get out there is we don't see these kind of addiction patterns. We don't see widespread harms from the screen time. We do see kids are very different, and Anya made great points, and it's very different across ages, right? So young kids, a lot of passive time on screens probably will have, and we know from research does have some influence on language development. They need that interactive effect. But, you know, as kids grow and the older kids that we work with, they're finding ways to get what they need from screens and from their friends. So when they're playing Fortnite together and they're teasing each other and they're bonding and having a collective thing, those are the kinds of needs that those kids have that they're fulfilling in that setting, right? So if we have the spaces we can guide them to and support them to, they'll extract the kinds of things they need. The younger kids, we need to be more present and more planful and more mindful about these things. But as they get older, we just have to kind of set the parameters and observe, kind of guide from behind.
Here's a related question from Jenny Brundine of Colorado Public Radio. Clinicians are worried about socially anxious kids who are their clients who are happy to be out of school, but now are spending their days on Xbox from morning until late at night. They worry about them not having any social connection until September. Are you seeing this, and what advice would you give those parents?
Candace, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I'll say, so this will get me shamed as a parent, but you know, the 4th grade classroom, I had to get them to stop right now. They're all streaming on their Xbox in the other room right now, playing, there's laughing. So I would pay more attention to kind of what they're doing, who they're with, if you need help connecting. But I would look at our kids right now and find out what brings them joy right now, what they want to do, right? So we don't want kids that are sad and bored and really missing their offline, you know, their daily activities. We want to support them in the best ways we can. And so maybe that's through Xbox. Maybe that's me spending the night playing, you know, whatever game it is. I'm not a huge gamer. I am really bad at it, and most adults, our reflexes are gone. We're going to lose. But it's something that we can do with our kids. And so, my kids are gaming more than usual. I actually let my 6-year-old join the 4th graders, and it turns out I have their moms texting and saying they're being so helpful for her. They're all working as a team to like teach her how to play the game. They're swapping out kind of skins and dances, and it's nothing I would have envisioned coming into this, right? But she was so starved for social interaction.
Yeah,
go ahead, Anya. I'll just say really quickly, hi, Jenny. And the thing is for that parent is to ask the question, though, is that kid on Xbox actually playing alone or not? That's the really critical difference. And I think a lot of parents are not actually going far enough to, so I'm assuming if they're worried that there's no social connection, in fact, that is a kid, one of the rare kids who's playing alone. And that is a different dynamic. So, but first to establish that's all I wanted to say.
I mean, if there's one good thing that comes out of this is parents depathologizing kids' normal video game behavior. It would be an amazing thing. I don't want to bury the point about social anxiety, because we find that anxiety grows through avoidance, right? So if people are anxious about something and they completely isolate themselves from ever having to do it, it doesn't help them overcome that anxiety. So if you have a kid who's stuck at home, this is a very anxiety producing context that we're all in right now, right? Anxiety is everywhere. So how do we deal with that? Can we become more emotionally literate as parents and as a family in understanding anxiety, understanding how it works, what's in our toolbox to overcome it? And then for kids, obviously, they're not going to be giving a live speech in front of their friends, but maybe there's a way that they can overcome social anxiety through social media, through making videos, or maybe maybe it's through being a leader to their younger siblings, or in my household, it was like, writing letters to the elderly neighbors, like how are there ways they can extend themselves socially, or giving a book report to grandpa or an elderly relative, over video chat. So extending themselves socially, virtually, and then continuing to stretch those muscles.
And I actually, you reminded me, so this is less about social anxiety than anxiety in general, but I just saw a really interesting report this morning coming out of England. So one of the things that's happening, and Candace, I know, is in the middle of doing this kind of thing, is that social scientists and researchers are like pivoting and doing amazing new science like right now, right? And there's a study in the UK with 45,000 people. It's the COVID-19 study, I think it's just called. And you can find the reports are getting downloaded every week already. There's already 3 of them. And it begins at 18 and then goes up. So it doesn't really address the question of younger kids. But one of the things about anxiety that's striking just in the first 3 weeks of this is that anxiety went down as the restrictions got clearer in the UK. And so I think that does speak to something that's really true about kids and adolescents' mental health, is that they do, and adolescents are still kids, as we established at the beginning. They're not done maturing and growing, and they need sort of a sense of security and hope and safety. And when the rules are clearer, both by the government and by the family, I actually think that makes a big difference for anxiety. That doesn't speak to the social anxiety question, which I think then the parents are going to have to work hard to come up with some creative ways to see if that kid can find other ways to get engaged. And I think it was Anya mentioned earlier, this same organization, so it's called the March Network, and they have on their website a really wonderful resource. These were all based in the UK, but there must be similar in the US, but with just a whole plethora of organizations that are creating online activities that people can do together, virtual choirs, virtual art projects, virtual poetry stuff. And so I'm sure there's more of that out there, but I'm thinking that might be a resource for people who are dealing with social anxiety issues specifically, as a place to look for new things to get involved in.
I'd also add that online digital mental health resources, there's a lot of them, so it's often overwhelming to kind of sift through them. But Cyber Guide, which is an organization that vets online mental health apps in terms of how they're evidence-based, how usable they are. So if parents are struggling and looking for resources, I would encourage them to check out that. It's putting a lot of our kind of proven evidence-based mental health therapies online. And so please check that out as well.
Well, great. I think we've still got some great questions, but I think we have to close this. I will point out a quip that somebody said is somebody who's a therapist said, one of my clients said that what she misses in high school is being dumb in unison. So anyway, I want to thank our guests, Lydia, Candace, and Anya, for a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank the funders for Adolescent Science Translation for sponsoring this webinar. And finally, I want to thank you, the attendees, for being here. As soon as this webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and it helps us improve. And finally, visit EWA.org for more webinars. We're going to have plenty in the next few months for some strange reason. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
All right.